Welcome to Women Kicking Glass, the only radio show on OC Talk Radio dedicated to empowering women to be the best leaders they can be in any endeavor they choose. Patty Grimm is our host and interviews top women in a variety of fields to help women grow, learn, and lean in together. Patty has over 25 years of experience in primarily male-dominated fields and senior-level management positions. Patty is the owner of Advantage Training Limited, an organizational leadership team training company. She recently released her new book for women called Quiet Women Never Changed History. Be strong, stand out, and stand up. With the subtitle, Let's Go Kick Some Glass.
And that's exactly what we're going to do with Patty and her guests.
Thanks, Paul, and I'm really excited to have our guest with us today. I was just telling her I happened to go to the doctor today to get some blood drawn. I read her book and was very passionate about it, so I'm very excited to have her on the show. But as I was getting my blood drawn this morning, I was actually rereading a couple of highlights out of her book. So that's how much I think it's a great book. When I read books, I read novels on my Kindle. But when I get a business book, I read it on a hard copy so that I can highlight things. And this book is yellow highlighted and dog-eared to death. So my guest today is Jude Miller Burke, PhD. She lives in Phoenix with over 20 years in management positions. She spent 10 years at Honeywell in Massachusetts managing their employee assistance and counseling and wellness programs. She spent 10 years as VP of operations at Optimum United Health Group and their subsidiary that started the 1-800 Call a Counselor registered nurse call. She's an executive coach and leadership coach. She's a national speaker, has presented at a number of national conferences. She is author of the incredible book, The Millionaire Mystique, How Working Women Become Wealthy and How You Can Too. And she just released her second book, which is extremely timely, called The Adversity Advantage, Turn Your Childhood Hardships into Career and Life Success. And I told her I was going to read this one quote out of her book, and this is actually from a woman who's a co-author of the Rich Dad Company, an author of Rich Woman. So this woman wrote this in Jude's book. It says, Dr. Jude Miller is a pioneer studying women millionaires and their personality traits, their work styles that propelled them from unremarkable into challenging beginning to astonishing success. No professional woman should work another day without reading this book. Now that is an endorsement. Wow. Thanks, Jude.
Thank you, Patty. Thanks for having me on your show. That's great.
So tell our audience a little bit about your background and your research and your passion and kind of how you got into this.
I went to the University of Minnesota and started working at a local crisis center there, and the smaller organization moved quickly into management, and then went on to Honeywell and spent 10 years at a large division of Honeywell and was their employee assistant psychologist and managed the wellness program and some of the medical departments, and then went on to United Healthcare. So I have quite a few years in leadership positions, supervising people, leading people to accomplish tasks, and at the same time, I would hear their problems, their personal problems and their work problems because of being in the area of employee assistance counseling. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a research geek myself. So you recently completed your research study on factors that led these women millionaires to success. What encouraged you to do this kind of study, and how did you end up, kind of studying this as a area of business or your life?
Well, of course, I saw very interesting things working in Fortune 100 companies that really stimulated my curiosity. But then I had moved from Minnesota to a wealthy suburb of Phoenix, and the homes were beautiful, and the lawns manicured, and, gorgeous-looking cars. But then over a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, the men and the women would share with me that either they grew up in poverty or experienced childhood abuse. And I was really struck by how they still went on to be successful. So much of the research says that if you experience adversity, that it will deter you from becoming financially or professionally successful. But I decided I really wanted to study it and contacted Dr. Mark Attridge, who I worked with at United Healthcare. We designed a scientific research study, so we used standardized measures, personality characteristics for work style, leadership styles, core self-evaluation, that were reliable and valid, and we did statistical analysis against the norms, and what we found is that not only were these people not deterred from being successful due to what they experienced as children, but they may have even honed some survival skills that they were able to translate into the workplace. But I was really curious. I have to say that, sexism is alive and well, and I've been working at the Fresh Start Women's Center here in Phoenix. We opened the doors about 12 years ago, and it's a really strong group of women, business women, that are on the board of directors. And my hunch was that there were more similarities between the successful men and women than differences. And that is what I found, that in terms of personality traits and work styles, leadership styles, there was more similarity than differences between the men and women. But then when we delved down into things like the gender differences came up. Well, some of the similarities, first of all, were conscientiousness. By far, the men and the women in this group, and over half of them were self-made millionaires and multimillionaires. And 75% of them came from middle-class to lower-income socioeconomic families. And so this was not a group of silver spoon women. These women made their own money, and they negotiated their personal life with their work life, which, as you and I both know, is not easy a lot of the time. And so they were conscientious, and they developed operational skills, and they made very clear recommendations about mentoring and building a social network and building social capital to get those opportunities. The women had lots of detours, lots of failures. Lots of detours were around childbearing and child rearing and taking care of elderly parents. And so often, and I found this interesting, that the women, even though oftentimes they were the primary breadwinner, they still hands down absorbed that second shift when they got home at night. So even when they were pulling in most of the income for the family, they were still making those lunches for the kids the night before, the next school day, and throwing the laundry in the washing machine and the dryer at night. Also, the women reported experiencing much more prejudice and discrimination than the men. Right. And it was so fun. At one point, I interviewed a number of the men and asked a lot of senior male leaders about the women, and I asked these men who had been running large companies if they thought leadership was more difficult for the women. 90% of them said definitely. And when I asked the men if they thought attaining financial and professional success for the women was more difficult, almost all the women said yes, of course, but almost all of the men did too. And I thought that was so great how the men were honest and stepped up and really, were frank about, they were running large companies, and they said, yes, the experience for women in terms attaining success was much more difficult, and also leadership. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm a bit of a research geek, and so I find research that I just get diving into it, and I have to really tell myself to stop, because at some point you can only get so much data, and you have a conversation with somebody and you start to splurt off all these numbers that women are still, make 80% of what men do. It's worse for Hispanic and African American women. You get all these facts in your head, and then you realize, oh my gosh, this conversation is not going in the right direction. So one of the things I know that in the book you talk about, what does success look like, and what are some of the attitudes of these people that are very successful. What did you find in your research that were some of the things that made these people, the working rich, who came through adversity and maybe difficult childhoods, or maybe they were just a middle-class family like a lot of us, and yet they were able to attain such wealth? What were some of the things you found that they had in common?
Well, they recommended specific foundational career experiences, and they recommended networking, which we've heard a lot about. Also a diversity of jobs throughout their careers, really seeking challenging positions and work assignments, getting operational line experience, getting managerial experience, creating their own positions. And the detours and failures were so common that it's almost as if they didn't take them personally, but looked at them as an opportunity to really change into their career into something better and different. The people, the women were much more, they had much more skill in terms of social influence techniques, so they had the ability to politically and interpersonally influence others. They had a range of masculine and feminine behaviors. So they were comfortable with conflict. I mean, we know how important it is as a leader in an organization and just as, just with your peers to really be comfortable and have a willingness to argue a point to closure and to not take it personally. And these women were comfortable arguing a point to closure. And so they had a range of more traditional feminine communication, but also masculine communication. So they were assertive when they needed to be, but they also were highly aware of the expectation of women to be more warm and supportive. So they had a fluidity between the different communication styles that they would utilize. Very high work engagement, very flexible for both the men and the women. But the female millionaires, they're flexible, adaptable, resilient, and many of them chose to own businesses. And so the national norm for that time period was 10% of people own their businesses, but 70% of these women had past or current business ownership.
Wow.
And it was interesting. They were conscientious. They had a higher core self-evaluation. They were, as I mentioned, they were more flexible and resilient and more extroverted.
Yeah, because you mentioned the work styles, that the personality work styles that you seem to find in common. You've kind of talked about some of those, but you talked about consciousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and the fourth one was, I'm trying to remember, openness to experience, which you kind of talked about a little bit. So can you talk about a few of those in more detail? Like, what do you mean by consciousness, extroversion, and what do you do if you're an introvert and you're not extroverted?
Well, we know now that introverted people can be fantastic leaders and fantastic coworkers. They just approach things a little differently. In fact, extroversion was one of the least personality characteristics that were needed to be successful. But conscientiousness, people that were very engaged in their work, people that followed through, they were on time, that they're the person that other people can rely on, that was very critical. Also, agreeableness really means flexible, team-oriented, concern for the rest of the group. And so the women who were highly successful, high achievers, were high in that area. And they were also very resilient and flexible. And so when the boss says, can you pick up this work assignment, or can you pick up this other work group to manage while the other supervisor's on leave, I mean, they really found a way to meet the needs of the company. And they were open to experiences. It was interesting, too, they had a lower level of neuroticism than the norm. So we had...
Yeah, what do you mean? Can you define what you mean by that?
Yep. And so, in other words, say they go into a meeting and you've got a bunch of vice presidents sitting around, and maybe there's only a certain pot of money, a certain amount of money for bonuses. So all the VPs are kind of arguing as to who should get how much and how the money should be split up. And so maybe one of the female VPs really has to go to the wall for her people. Maybe she feels like they're not getting enough, and they produced the most this past year, and maybe they had the greatest profit margin. And so she's going to the wall. I mean, she's arguing with all of her peers. She goes home that night, and she's able to leave it at work, where neuroticism is worrying, rumination, letting things like disrupt your sleep, letting things erode your self-esteem. So lower level of neuroticism for the women means that they can leave it at work, and they found a way to compartmentalize.
That's interesting because it's sort of like, I call it awfulizing. I'm not sure it's a word, but awfulizing, that you just think about how awful this is, and you get into this awfulizing cycle, and then you can't sleep, and then because you can't sleep, you're not as productive and alert at work, so then you can't sleep, and so your performance goes down, and you just get into this downward spiral. And it sounds like the women that are really resilient, or the leaders that are really resilient, are able to separate that and understand that, yeah, they fought really hard at work, but then come home and put that aside to take care of the things they need to take care of, their significant other, their spouse, their dog, their cat, whatever. So they're able to sort of set that aside.
Right, very true. And they have higher than the norm life satisfaction, but we all know that has a lot more to do with other things than money. I mean, after you attain a certain amount of comfort in your life, what really is important is how well are your kids doing, and how are your relationships doing, and how's your own health. So they had a greater than normal life satisfaction, and they also had a higher than the norm positive self-regard. So they felt good about themselves. They felt good about what they had accomplished in spite of all the adversity they maybe had to confront and all the obstacles they had to overcome to become successful.
Yeah. Yeah, because I'm looking at your book, and you've got one section about what the successful attitude looks like of the rich, and you've got, they're optimistic, they're passionate, they're engaged and enthusiastic, they know who's important, they make people feel important at ease, they sense the motivation of others, they choose and manage their reactions. A lot of that sounds like they're really high in EQ, emotional intelligence. Did you find any correlation between that or anything at all?
Yes, I did, and I didn't use that term in the book, but definitely they talked about managing their own emotions and their own thoughts. So they had a self-discipline in terms of how they managed their behaviors and their own thoughts and their emotions at work, and how they managed other relationships. And it wasn't because they did not experience childhood adversity either. I mean, this is a group of women who had their fair of, issues in childhood, whether that be witnessing domestic violence or being abused as a kid, or chemically dependent family members. So they had adversity to overcome. And maybe that made them a little bit wiser, too, and a little more reflective, which it has a tendency to do.
Yeah. Interesting. So one of the things is I'm working on my second book, Play the Game by Your Rules. It's sort of the secrets of women's leadership, empowerment, and equality. And one of the things I've actually done some talks on is that, how girls, even as much as we're raising girls to play soccer nowadays or baseball or different sports, and we've got Title IX, which entitles women to scholarships, and Serena Williams is the highest paid athlete in the world. So we've got all these positive things happening, and yet girls many times I think girls might be raised to be more perfectionists than risk takers. And you made a comment about that the women who were very successful didn't take things as personally. And so one of the things I read was saying that sometimes when women are raised as perfectionists as little girls, and they're told to be nice and polite, and when they go play soccer, they've got to have the perfect ribbon and the perfect socks and the perfect shoes, and they're expected to be these perfect young ladies and also be smart and bright and play football or play soccer and various things, is that the girls kind of take things more personally than the boys. The boys can show up at a soccer match with shoes that don't match, clothes that don't match, socks don't match, their hair's not combed, and sometimes they don't even brush their teeth. And yet, and I don't know if you've seen this as well, but it seems like sometimes men get into conversations at work that are very heated, and they have really big arguments. They can even have an argument on the golf course or tennis thing, but then they could walk away from it. And I've seen some women, probably not the women that you studied, that they can't let go of that. They don't have what you just said where they can come home after a tough day and let go of it. Did you find anything in that area in terms of that maybe women need to just learn to be a little bit tougher sometimes?
Right. I think that's true, and that we're socialized to be kind and to be giving, and that our measure of ourselves as women is in how much we take care of others, and that our self-esteem is wrapped up in, our relationship with others. And so when you go into work and your job is really to negotiate conflict and to be assertive and to meet the needs of the organization and of your work group, I mean, it's very difficult for women, and it may take some practice. And obviously, how you're impacted by having to fire. I remember the first time I had to fire an employee, I think I cried for 24 hours, where, 10, 15, 20 years down your career, then you have more experience and you have more perspective, and you understand that your obligation is to meet the needs of the organization and to do what's best for the organization. So I think you have more emotional self-management. And in relationship to what you're saying about young women, at the very time we have all these incredible female athletes, whether they're snowboarders or skiers or tennis players or, winning the Olympics, whatever it might be, we still have had this upsurge in, the Victoria's Secret kind of models and social media and all the girls taking overly sexualized pictures of themselves at a young age. And so even like 13-year-old girls are clearly getting the message that their worth is tied up in their appearance. And, I think that as a parent, it's really important to talk directly to your kids about that. And it's somewhat there for young men, too, but to really talk to the girls about that their measure and their worth is just so much more than their appearance. And I think as a parent, one of the best things you can do is role model for your kids to not always be on a diet, to not criticizing yourself. I know. The other day,
I need to lose 10 pounds, right? I've been trying to lose these 10 pounds for 30 years.
Right. But I know the other day my son said to me, Mom, you and, like my daughter, she goes, you two, my sister, you two need to stop saying negative things about yourself. And I looked at him and I forced myself to say, honey, I know I'm pretty. I know I'm attractive. And he just looked at me. And I thought, I wish I would have been doing that for many, many years, because our kids will mimic exactly how we treat ourselves. And so for young women, the more we can role model self-acceptance, the better it is for the next generation. And with a lot of the college girls I know, I have seen a lot of improvement where they're not wearing makeup necessarily to classes. They're not dressing up. And I think it's a little bit geographic. There are geographic differences. But some of the schools emphasize the intellect of the young women much more than others. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because if you can look at any of the female athletes, Serena Williams or any of the ones that are out there, they're on the field, they're in their sport, they're winning their game, but yet they need to come off the field and they need to look beautiful, right? They still need to put on the makeup and look pretty and all those kinds of things. So I think we have some work to do there of helping to raise our girls to be brave risk takers and less about perfectionists, that it's okay to be yourself. I've heard a lot of young girls are getting basically thigh surgery to make that thigh gap so that they look skinny like some of these real skinny models, and they never think they're pretty enough or good enough, and that leads to the imposter syndrome and all kinds of things that kind of cycle through that. So we're going to take a quick commercial break in just a second. And when we come back, I'd like to talk about I want to talk some more about this, but I also want to, before we take a break, is ask you to tell us how we can get in touch with you. Where can people reach you? How can they get your book? And we'll do that again at the end. So we want to make sure we do this a couple of times. So first off, how can we find you? And please spell your name or your email so that we can make sure that that's how we get in touch with you, or your website. So go ahead.
All right. It's JudeMillerBurke.com. And both of my books are on Amazon.com, The Millionaire Mystique and The Adversity Advantage, Turn Your Childhood Hardship into Work and Life Success.
Okay. Well, great. Well, we'll come back, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the gender differences, and then I really want to talk about this overcoming adversity, because obviously Sheryl Sandberg came out with her book. She's been promoting Option B, Overcoming Adversity. But I want to talk about your point of view and your research that you've done on it and how people have used adversity to their advantage. So we'll come back from the commercial. We'll talk about some of that.
Imagine what it would feel like to lose everything. Your job, your home, your family, your dignity. This has happened to thousands of the men, women, veterans, and young adults we serve at Working Wardrobes. What do we do to help? We provide career development services, life skills workshops, job skills training. We provide the perfect interview outfit, and we get clients placed in jobs. Call Working Wardrobes, 714-210-2460. Donate, volunteer, invest, hire.
When it comes to pioneers in their respective industries, we all know the Apples, Starbucks, and Trader Joe's of the world. In the realm of recruiting, Decision Toolbox is the industry's best-kept secret. with 90% of their business from referrals and repeat customers. For over 20 years, Decision Toolbox's U.S.-based team of recruiters, sourcers, professional writers, quality personnel, and tech support has perfected a Six Sigma approach to talent management. No matter the size of the project, Decision Toolbox delivers incredible results. A cost per hire less than half of what contingency firms charge, with the winning candidate presented in an average of 14 days, all with a 12-month candidate warranty. With results like that, Decision Toolbox won't be a secret for long. Visit us at www.dtoolbox.com for more information.
And now back to Patty and her guest.
Hi, this is Patty Grimm. I'm with Jude Miller Burke. Jude Miller Burke.
That's okay.
She's a PhD. She's author of The Millionaire Mystique, How Working Women Became Millionaires and How You Can Too. And her newest book, which we're going to talk about, her newest book is called The Adversity Advantage, Turn Your Childhood Hardships into Career and Life Success. So before we go on to the adversity topic, I just want to hit one more thing on your book about the millionaire mystique and how women can become millionaires. What were some of the gender differences you saw? You kind of talked about the similarities. What were some of the gender differences you saw between men and women who became millionaires?
The women were a little more extroverted than the men, and the men and the women acknowledged that leadership is different for women. The women really described using a transformational leadership style, which was more painting a vision for the work group, supporting each individual employee's needs, affirming each individual employee. The women recommended the autocratic leadership style less often. And the women reported more discrimination and prejudice. The men and the women said that it was more difficult for the women to become financially and professionally successful. The women would absorb more of the second shift at home. The women worked a few less hours on average than the men. They were still both sexes were working much more than full time to achieve what they did professionally. But the women were working a few less hours. The women had more detours than the men, even though the men had a lot of detours also, but the women had more detours related to taking care of aging family members, taking care of ill family members, childbearing and child rearing. So that kind of summarizes a little bit of the differences between the genders. The pathway to success, though, and the personality traits were pretty similar in terms of what led them to their success. Both sexes were comfortable negotiating conflict, and as you mentioned, from a societal perspective, that's really more difficult for women, and I think that's true. So they really became a student of communication and of conflict management to be successful. And they were less neurotic. The women were a little more worried, they worried a little more than the men did, but at the same time, compared to the national norm, the women were a lot less worriers than the normative population.
It's interesting because when I did my research for my book, I interviewed about 1,850 men and women leaders, and one of the questions I ask is, what makes a great woman leader, and is there a difference between a great woman leader and a great man leader? And the answer was yes, by 75% of the people, or 76% of the people said yes, there was a difference. And the differences you cite in your research were very similar to the differences in mine. When you looked at the top 10 characteristics of men and women, they were very similar, but the top 5 were in different orders. Right, men were more strategic thinkers. Women were more developers of people, visionary, collaborators. So it was very interesting. And the one person I interviewed was a woman who was in the first graduating class of women from West Point. And she didn't have a glass ceiling. She had a concrete bunker. She's now a very successful woman. She served in the military for over 30 years. And her comment was very interesting to me. She said, women leaders see around the corners. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? She said, a man is in a meeting and he has an agenda, and he'll go through his agenda and think it's a great meeting, and he'll get to the end of the meeting and everybody will go back to work. He didn't notice that maybe a couple of the people were disengaged or there was a lot of conflict, that the people were uncomfortable with. He won't say anything. He'll just go through the meeting and think it was a great meeting. The woman will either, during the meeting, try and engage those people. Like, Jude, it seems like you have a comment, or they'll talk to you afterwards and says, it seems like you were uncomfortable in the meeting. So they kind of have that, I hate to use the words women's instinct or intuition, but they kind of had that caregiver gene, I guess, a little bit more. So that was kind of interesting. There was also some parallels in both of our books and the research that we had done. There were quite a few parallels.
That is interesting. Not surprising, but, very interesting. Yes, and so often the women talk about that fine line of being assertive and businesslike, while they felt at the same time they really needed to be warm and friendly. And so they kind of learned to walk that line, which sometimes is exhausting, but they felt like as women that people expected them to be warm and supportive, and that they felt like things went more smoothly than when they were.
Well, so since we're talking about women tend to have more challenges and adversities to overcome, let's talk about the research for your second book around overcoming adversities. And the most recent, phase of your study focuses on overcoming those adversities. And you said 40% of the people you studied had serious childhood hardships. What were your findings in that area?
40% of the 310 people I studied, and the women experienced this just as much as the men, experienced either an alcoholic, substance-abusing parent, witnessed domestic violence, or were abused as children. And I interviewed a lot of people for the book, too, so it has people's stories. I've created self-assessments so people can really take a look at their own childhood and see if there is some adversity that's still affecting them that might be negatively impacting them at work. So people were very honest about, and the women talked about how it affected them as adults, and it impacted their self-esteem negatively. They had more shame. They were more fearful of conflict at work and had more anxiety. They reported more prejudice and discrimination. And so the women were very descriptive in terms of how their childhood adversity impacted them as adults. And we know it's not the workplace's job to help someone heal. We know that's not the case. But it does happen. And one of the leaders that I interviewed, she basically said, well, we've all had adversity. And, you go to work, you take new assignments, you get challenged, you get rewards, and it helps you heal. And so it helps you leave the past behind. And I think that's very true. If you look at other adversity, such as death of a parent or another family member, mental illness of a family member, or poverty, pretty much over 1 out of every 2 employees is coming into work with kind of a negative template from the past. They report higher anxiety, more depression, as I mentioned before, fear of conflict, less comfort with the opposite sex. But they also talked about the survival skills that they honed to get through their childhoods. And many of them became students of life. So when they were growing up, conflict was maybe a plate flying across the room and hitting the wall and shattering, or screaming and yelling or swearing, or doors slamming. But then they get into work and they realize they don't have a good template for communication or for conflict management. And so they become a student of these different things and really start to excel with their communication and building relationships. We've all had that experience where you're sitting at your desk and someone reaches across your shoulder but maybe grazes your shoulder to point at your computer screen. And that's an example of how you respond to that. Maybe all of a sudden your breathing gets very quick and your stomach gets tight and you feel anxious. That's a trigger at work. Or maybe there's someone at work who points their finger and talks in a very authoritative way, and you just wilt and feel very young and small. There are many different triggers, and the triggers can be situations, or the triggers can be different types of people. So we have these triggers, and I think it's so important to be aware of them and then to manage our reactions to other people. So this group of women that I studied really had become students of communication, building relationships. Unfortunately, what was lagging behind is their self-esteem. They still really had some self-esteem issues and also experienced more issues in their personal adult life.
Yeah.
Such as more divorces. But hands down, and I think this is kind of humorous, that the women, the more adversity they experienced, the more likely they were to start their own business. Almost like no one's going to be the boss of me.
Yeah, if I can't get along with people, I'll start my own company.
Right, and just as a self-protective, they really had a self-protective style. They'd be nice and cordial at work with people and learn to get along with people, but they really didn't want to socialize with people at work. They didn't really want to form close personal bonds. And so it's the work style was very resilient, but also self-protective.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's the women tend to suffer more from the imposter syndrome, the lack of self-esteem, lack of self-confidence. You can talk to many women, including myself, who made it to a certain level. Like I was a vice president of a big California bank by the time I was 29, and I look around thinking, do I really deserve this? I mean, what I haven't, it's kind of that self-doubt you have. And I was raised to be in a very tomboy, very sports-like environment. And so I was kind of raised in sports and competition and was able to thrive through a lot of that and have conversations with people about sports that many couldn't. But I still sort of had that, am I really good enough? Because I always remember my dad was amazing. I had a wonderful father, worked for the same company for 45 years. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. Wonderful childhood, middle child in a middle-class family. But I never felt I was good enough, right? If I got an A, I should have gotten an A+, right? If I won a tennis match in 4 sets, I should have run it in 3. I mean, it was just constant as never quite good enough. And yet, as an adult, I think it's helped me in some ways be better at what I do. So I'm trying to, that perfectionism comes back, right? It's never good enough. I'm constantly trying to improve things. And so, building up some of the some resiliency. So did the people you talk to, and I know in your first book, your Millionaire Mystique book, you have a resiliency risk assessment. Right. Did any of the people you interviewed in your first or second book talk about how they built up their resiliency? Because that's a term I'm hearing a lot in business today, not just Sheryl Sandberg's new book before that came out. People talking about building resiliency as an individual, as a leader, and even as companies. So any hints on building resiliency?
Yes. And in my latest book, and also the previous book, I end each chapter with bullet points and recommendations. So both books have self-assessments and then very specific recommendations to have healthier boundaries or to become a better leader or to improve your self-esteem or to improve your communication skills. But in terms of resilience specifically, yes, these are people who have become successful in their own right, whether they're international artists or CEOs of companies. And they, many of them mention their spirituality. They have found a way to increase their mindfulness. Many people talk about exercise. People talk about forgiveness and self-acceptance. Having someone be witness to their story so they feel like their story's been validated. And the whole last chapter of my book is, yes, you can feel better. You really, you don't make much income from a book at all. So it's really about giving back. And for me, it's really important, to teach people. This is almost like therapy in a book. If you don't have the money or the time to go to therapy, read this book, take these assessments. And the last chapter will tell you very specifically what you can do to become stronger. Another example would be take your story, and we all get so attached sometimes, overly attached to our negative experiences, and they almost become kind of like a lens through which we see the rest of life and kind of like an old, burdensome childhood friend, right? But sit down and rewrite your story of your family and focus on some of the positive qualities that your family had and that you have as a result of your family. And just take a look at those survival skills. One of the people I interviewed in the book had a mentally ill father, and I had known this person from when I had worked with him, and he had impeccable people skills. I had no idea that he had a severely mentally ill father. But when I interviewed him, I heard that, and I heard the story about how he transformed that negative experience into some very unique and special survival skills that have really helped him achieve things at work. So yes, there's all kinds of suggestions in the book on how to become stronger. The key as a parent, I have 3 children, and so I think about that quite a bit, is that you want your kids to experience some adversity and learn to negotiate it themselves, whether that's some difficulties at school or difficulties with friends or, with a teacher or a specific grade or not making the soccer team or basketball team they wanted to. You want them to have that kind of adversity. Of course, if you can protect them from the more traumatic things, that is definitely the way to go, because it's those really adverse traumatic events that haunt us and follow us around in our adult lives until we turn around and face them and accept them and come to terms with them and resolve them. And that's what this last book is about.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about this, but what were, describe some of the positives that the people you interviewed talked about, the survival skills they learned to cope as children, how that's helping them today. So, you talk about any positives from the survival skills they learned that are helping them cope as adults today. Can you give some examples of that? You gave one, I think.
Sure. The women said they were more independent.
Right.
They were more flexible and resilient. They were more driven, as you mentioned. Nothing like a critical parent to make someone more driven. They really learned to develop a lot of different competencies. They were empathic. A lot of the women expressed a pride in surviving what they went through. The women talked about being compassionate for the underdog. They were very committed to their families and did not want to continue the cycle of abuse onto the next generation. They talked about being committed to leading a values-driven life. Many of the women talked about helping others. And so they really took a lot of their survival skills and, turned them into things they could do at work, which made them have more authentic relationships and have more social capital because people believe in them, people liked being around them, people believed that they were honest and truthful. Yeah. Now, of course, there's the person who grew up in an abusive family and goes into work and throws their computer against the wall, right? But usually when that happens, especially today, the Human Resources Department is knocking on their office door or their boss is talking to them about that's not appropriate. So the workplace also has a way for guiding you into appropriate behavior and letting you know what's inappropriate behavior if you're yelling at your peers or people you supervise.
Yeah. And I feel like I had a really super opportunity in life, and I was always one of these people that felt like, I could do anything. My dad always said I could be as good as any boy or anybody. I could do anything I wanted to put my mind to. And then I had my own sort of internal challenge in that I'd gone from being the number one top performer with the highest raise I ever got and the most stock options I ever got when I worked for Microsoft. And then within a year, I was literally almost in the depressed anxiety stage where I actually took a 4-month sabbatical off to figure out what had gone wrong and what I had, where I had contributed to my own downfall. I mean, my performance went down. I love to cook. I couldn't even cook a recipe. I mean, I basically imploded from working 80, 90 hours a week and every night and every weekend. I just literally got to a point where my body and my mind completely shut down. And so I took that 4 months off. I went and found some good people to help me. I went and read Louise Hay's You Can Heal Your Life and Cheryl Richardson's Art of Extreme Self-Care. And I went through every single exercise, including talking to the mirror about something my mother had done when I wanted a prom dress, and she wouldn't get it for me because I had so many other prom dresses. Why did I need a new one? I went through all of that, and I have to say, going through that, I really realized what happened is I had allowed myself to get so engaged with my job and my work, I had lost sense of myself. I had lost sense of my personal vision, my values. I lost sense with my family, my friends. People invite me over. I would just be sort of like, literally like a shell. And I picked myself up and got things going, and within 4 months I was back and stronger, and that's what put me on the passion to write the book, because my book is all about helping other women avoid the crash or the fall that I had, or be able to recognize it sooner so they don't hit rock bottom before they can pull themselves out. I mean, Adriana Huffington talks about, she woke up with her face bleeding because she cracked her cheek on her computer because she was so exhausted. Mine was sort of a slow implode. But when it happened, the doctor just basically said, if you don't take a leave of absence, you're going to die in 6 months. And I pulled myself out of that. And so now I tell people, take care of yourself. Eat, pray, love, exercise. Take time for yourself. I've changed my routine. In the mornings, I don't get on my computer. I go outside and I pray and meditate and do 5 sun salutations. I walk the dogs. I read something inspirational before I even think about opening my computer or my phone. And so I turned my life, my adversity I faced around. And that's what drove me to write the first book and to continue to write other books. And like you said, you don't make much money off the books. It really is sort of a give-back charity thing. But I just literally learned so much. So what did the high achievers who weathered childhood problems recommend to come to terms with these early hardships? Or even mine was a late hardship, right? So what would you recommend?
I think that your tribe, the people you have that you surround yourself with, are very important. And that with social media and the number of hours people are working to make ends meet and to achieve at a high level, I mean, what's suffering is their social network. And it's really important to have at least a few people that you keep close. Yep. And then to, as you talked about, slow down your life so you know what you're feeling. I mean, one of the jokes with millennials in New York City is we don't have time to feel. Well, you can either stop and slow down and have your feelings, or else they'll follow you around until you go to sleep at night and disrupt your sleep. So you might as well take some time in the morning or during the day and do some self-reflection, do some journal writing, seek out counseling if there are things that you feel like, would be helpful to talk about. And self-care, I mean, we treat ourselves how we were taught to treat ourselves. And so if you experience adversity as a child and no one was really parenting you or taking care of you, then you're not going to know how to take care of yourself as an adult. But you don't want those implosions. You want to take care of yourself. You want to keep yourself healthy. Schedule your doctor's appointments. Develop your spirituality. Do some journal writing, and be a lifelong learner about yourself and about other people. I mean, it's it's the long haul. It's not just the short haul that you're in this for. And so the better you can take care of yourself, the better you'll feel, and the more you will have to give at work and to other people. And so the last chapter of the book, and in the appendix of the book, I actually have the journey chart where, there's what you experienced as a child, how it affects you physically and emotionally, how it might be impacting you negatively at work, how it might be impacting you personally negatively, and then what resources you need and what avenues you can pursue to heal.
Yeah.
And you can do it at 25 or you can do it at 55, but it all stays with you until you take the time to stop and reflect and to gain a greater understanding of yourself and your own temperament and your experiences.
Exactly. Like I said, when I was reading your book the first time, if you saw my copy of your book, you would literally laugh. I've got page after page is dog-eyed turned down, and I've got things highlighted and things saying, oh, that's a really cool quote, or I just can't believe how much there are similarities in many ways in terms of our research and what we did, but also our passion. I mean, I can't believe you're in Arizona.
I know. That is great. That is really fun to hear.
Yeah. Great. So how about just one last time, tell us the names of your books, which we all know are on Amazon. And by the way, please do us both a favor. If you buy our books, please go back to Amazon and write a review. It really helps. But name again how people can get in touch with you and what the names of your 2 books are.
Okay, and quickly, too, one thing we did not address that I wanted to say is that one of the most important decisions you can make for your career is who you decide to marry or have as your partner. And to really discuss things as simple as who's going to get up in the middle of the night if you have children, who's going to take the children if they're ill to the doctor the next day. So you want to be with someone who's supportive of your career. That's just really critical. My books are The Millionaire Mystique, How Working Women Become Wealthy, and You Can Too. My second book is The Adversity Advantage, Turn Your Childhood Hardship into Career and Life Success. My name is Jude Miller Burke, and my books can be bought on Amazon.
Thank you, and thanks for the word on the having a supportive significant other, because my husband and I have been married 34 years, and he's been my partner. He was Mr. Mom for 5 years when I was working in the corporate world for a while and took care of the kids, and incredibly supportive, so that's an important part of it as well. So it's about your health, wealth, your management, and your life. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Just a couple of last-minute things. You can get in touch with me at pattygrimm@live.com. That's P-A-T-T-I-E. At live.com. I am looking for sponsors for the show, so just like PBS, I'm looking for people to sponsor the show so we can keep the show going and keep it on the air. I'm available for keynotes, presentations, workshops, webinars, and also if you want to contact me or find my book's called Quiet Women Never Change History, Be Strong, Stand Up, Stand Out, and the subtitle is Let's Go Kick Some Glass. So thanks for being with us today, and go out there and kick some glass. Have a great day and great week.
Thanks for listening to Women Kicking Glass, the only radio show on OC Talk Radio dedicated to empowering women to be the best they can be. Listen each week or download the podcast at patty.grimm.podbean.com. To reach out to Patty to schedule a speech webinar or to learn more about her leadership and team training, contact Patty at pattygrimm@live.com. For more information about her company and her books, have a kicking day.